I'm editor-in-chief for Battery Journal. I'm here today at 14th Street, the South Plaza, with artist Kenseth Armstead to talk about his new project, his monument entitled Washington 2020. Hi, welcome, and thank you for being here with me.
Thanks for coming out. We appreciate it.
So this title, Washington 2020, has significance in terms of how it relates to history, and specifically, I would say, to facts or statistics sorely left out and errantly left out of the history books. Can we talk about that?
So I wanted to do a project on the history and the legacy of George Washington, but in doing so, I had to address some ideas around him. In 1776, when Washington was stationed in New York, there were 20,000 enslaved Africans in New York City. 1 in 10 persons in New York was a slave in 1776. And so the piece is critical of that, but then it also celebrates that in 1781, 20% of Washington's army was African. So 1 in 5 of his soldiers was an African who was fighting for American liberty, even though the vast majority of Africans in America would not be able to participate in the full sense of all men being created equal. And then finally, 20% of the American population in general, in the colonial population, 20% were Africans who were enslaved. And then even after the Revolution, 20% of the African population are enslaved. So Washington 2020 takes a 360 view of this historical figure and puts him in context, but also I think makes our view of history more complex, and I think in that way more beautiful.
Absolutely. So, to my mind, it seems as though your work is in part about inclusion of historical facts that have been left out, and I know that this is part of a larger project called and that is a very historically rigorous project that you've been working on for over 10 years?
Well, sort of, yeah. I think I started out doing 10 years of work on an historical figure named James Armstead Lafayette, who was a slave and a spy for George Washington. And he helped end the American Revolution. But then once I started to look at James Armstead Lafayette and why he wasn't considered a founder when everybody else, Nathan Hale, who was a spy, is considered a founder, but James Armstead Lafayette wasn't considered a founder, I found all these other Africans in the American Revolution. That was 10 years worth of work. That project is called Spook. Spook is kind of a fertile ground that led me to all these facts and figures about the American Revolution. I didn't really know what to do with all of that emotionally, and I didn't really know what to do with all of that as a project because I had so much information that I'd done, and I'd become pretty much a foremost expert on Africans in the American Revolution. And then I finally ended that project after 10 years, and other people started doing work on James Armstead Lafayette, and there are multiple books, and so what ended up happening is that I wanted to make a series that dealt with the mindset of an African who was enslaved, fighting for revolution, for all men to be created equal, knowing he wasn't going to get any. And that's where Fatherland came. So I never say founding fathers, because when you say that, you're not including the founding mothers, you're not including the Africans, you're not including the history of the Chinese in America, you're just basically excluded. So I say founding father, and that's how that project became the project that it was. So founding father is about looking farther, is about looking around the historical figures that we most celebrate and finding the vast majority of the people who are fighting for liberty are this diverse cast of characters, most of whom aren't household names. And my work helps celebrate them and lament the loss, but also create beauty around all of these figures and give them a sort of emotional mark in artwork.
So this exhaustive research, and I'm coming to this piece from the perspective of pedagogy, art history, also an artist, and so the richness of this piece really strikes me in terms of the level of rigor, scholarly rigor, and also a studio praxis that I know is incredibly rigorous. And I feel you're driven. You really have a mission. And is it a mission to instruct, to educate, to revise and insert important information that's been left out? history books in the past. Now, as you say, perhaps as being contextualized. But do you feel you have to work even harder because there's a lot of information that really needs to be mined and aggregated and put forth and presented in the name of enlightenment and education?
I think, first and foremost, my mission as an artist is to make works that are really engaging visually. And this is a very hard thing to do, especially if you start out with data points and facts and history books, which most people don't read the history books. We all take history because we have to. So when I approach a work, this is a site where, being here has activated George Washington and allowed people to see him in a new way. And also, it allows people to have an open way of dealing with history as a source. But I don't think of it that I'm educating people. I don't think of that way at all. It's just that my inspiration, my media is history. My medium is history. I'm always looking at a historical moment, and then I have an emotional reaction to that, and I try to find materials that allow me to really communicate my reaction to a historical moment. And then along the way, people educate themselves. Some people because they disagree, some people because they disagree, but it allows for a really complicated relationship to what most people think is a fixed thing. They think they have history and they can't open it up. But essentially, history changes every time you look at a new point within it.
Absolutely. So your work also seems incredibly generous as you do this work here as a public project to really present to the public. And while you may not specifically consider yourself to be an educator, it is an education. It was an education for me. I learned a lot in the research of this project, just in planning for our conversation. And so I'm kind of struck by this tireless and really seemingly ceaseless effort to contextualize, to bring together in many ways. I know you've written a book, and I know you've also worked on film.
Screenplay.
Screenplay. Okay, screenplay. All right.
I make no false claims of being able to produce a book.
And you're also a rock star. I know that too. So all of these efforts are to kind of bring together the research you're doing, your studio practice, and you do public projects. And that's really the theater of operation. You cease to exist quite often in the public realm. Tell me about that aspect. Why public projects?
In 2012, I was a right-handed artist, and then I ran out of time on this one drawing, and I needed hours and hours of time to make work. And so I can only draw 6 hours a day with my right hand. So I added 6 hours a day drawing with my left hand. So this led me to really rethink how I worked entirely. And in 2012, I wouldn't have said that my projects would have had a public component, or that I would have made sculpture outside of the studio or the gallery or the museum space. But then by the end of 2013, I was a fully left-handed artist, and I was conceiving of the way that I worked in a completely different way. So then someone asked me, can you do a public art piece? And I was like, yes, I can. I will. And I had no idea whether or not I could, but I knew that I should say yes. So this was at Olana in 2014, so I knew it was coming up in 2014. It took me 9 months to move from having a studio practice that was right-handed to being a left-handed artist who was then making work in the public realm. They said, we have an acre, but it looks onto 250 acres. You have to work with that. And I was at the time making drawings that were 9 inches by 12 inches. And there were a bunch of them, so they could fill a 2,000, 3,000 square foot space. But doing what I do in terms of making compelling images outside of a studio, outside of a lit space, it took me 9 months working outside to come up with a piece that would work. And once I did that, I thought, well, I'll never get invited to do another piece. But then I applied for some other things, and I got one. I was like, oh. So then the next year I did another piece, and then I got other commissions. And so now, since 2014, I've been working as a site-specific artist, and I never really want to go back in terms of the way that I work. I like that the way that I work now is still about history as a medium, but if I do it correctly, I take what's there and make more there. And this is not super complicated, but it is, like simple is the hardest thing. So whenever I go to a site whether it's George Washington or whether it's Olana, where it's the oldest earthwork in America, I'm engaging a landscape, and I have to deal with working in someone's home or a living environment, and that is a very I consider it a challenge, but I also consider it a privilege.
As well as a big scale shift.
Yeah.
As you were saying, a big scale shift, materials necessarily change, and your audience perhaps changes.
But between 2012 and 2013, I did a lot of things, and they were like, I wanted to not know my limits. I wanted to push myself, and I jumped out of a plane. I drove a Formula car. I started being left-handed. And every rule that I had, or every limit that I had, I tested it and pushed myself out to the limit. So by 2014, when I was ready to install a piece in an acre that looked under 250 acres, I was not without fear. I just knew my fear. I had embraced my fear, and it was a fuel that went with my need to engage history and to make images. And now, part of this piece is that, this is a place that people live. People really live in this part. I'm not making this piece for myself. I'm making this piece so that other people can engage it. And that is something that's very different than what most artist practice is or would be normal. So people will go to a gallery expecting to see art. And now most of the way that I make work is to be in a space where people are surprised that there is art.
So then your work, this piece specifically, and the work surrounding this 10 years of your projects that are based on fartherland, to a large extent, it opens up a space for historical analysis, critique, maybe even interrogation, but also a space to posit new information that has been missing.
Sure. Well, I don't I'm not a historian. I've done more historical work on the last bit of the American Revolution and the Africans in it than almost anybody else on the planet. But I only did that so that I could make visual statements that were strong. The more research I did, the more reactions I had to it, and the stronger the work became. And I don't do that for myself. I do that because I want to engage a broader dialogue. In the 90s, I spent a long time, 10 years, doing work on the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X, and normalizing Islam in the American context. And at the beginning of the 90s, Malcolm X was a pariah. By the end of the 90s, myself, Poor Righteous Teachers, Spike Lee, all these people had been doing work on this subject. And at the end of the 90s, Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam, they're American heroes, and they're normal parts of American society. So in that way, I don't see myself as a sculptor now so much as a social sculptor. And I'm engaging in a political space, but I'm not engaging that political space to make political statements. I'm just allowing that this dialogue happen. And most of the time, people do the work. I'm not doing work for them. I'm bringing a certain set of facts, and they have to adjust. Once you see that 1 in 5 soldiers in the American Revolution was an African, you can't see the American Revolution in the same way again. And from the very beginning in the essence of the Americas, there's always been people of color here, whether they were brought here by force or whatever. They're here fighting to preserve the liberty and grow America as a place, and especially after there's this notion that this is going to be literally the first place on the planet where all men are created equal. There were people of color always willing to fight for that. And then there are other ideas, and maybe why I'm so interested. My father fought in World War II. My brothers fought in Vietnam. There's always been a warrior in every generation of my family, my nephews, Iraq, etc. And you realize that we may have an idea that only certain people have access to the history of America, but I want that to open up, and I want people to be able to engage it in a new way. But how they engage it and whether or not they engage it, that's a choice they make. And I mostly embrace that through trying to engage them with beauty, complex imagery, and in this particular case, the materials are from the American Revolution. Tar and feathers, all the colors are red, white, and blue, and the colors that can be made from red, white, and blue, so shades of purple and pink. And then because I'm here in Union Square and I'm engaging New York architecture, the whole idea of the history and legacy of New York and American architecture itself is verticality. That just wouldn't be possible without girdered steel. And so this is an angle iron piece because angle iron is essential to the Empire State Building and the whole notion of American architecture, how we do it. So this piece, all the pieces will have one new material as a substrate of some sort, a thing to hold all the other pieces together. It might be aluminum, it might be wood, it might be lumber, but all of them have that as an element. But this one had to be steel because I was engaging the cityscape, and this cityscape is steel. That's how we do it. Later in the 70s and 60s, 70s, 80s, you get the glass box, but that's not signature to how it is we do it. That's in addition to how it is that we make architecture. This is the way, you know. And as I do research on architecture, and you know, all my friends are architects, and as I gather information, I try to take all those things, crunch them together, and then come up with things that will be seductive or abrasive, and usually both.
So it strikes me, in terms of the physicality of your piece, the way it interacts or engages the pre-existing structure, the granite plinth or pedestal, it creates at once a screen or a multivalent language that is at once symbolic, formally very rich. I think of more of like a postmodernist grid, if you will, sort of multivalent levels of meaning here. And they speak a very different language, and yet they're in dialogue in a very, I think, complex and beautiful way. I mean, decidedly, when you took on this project, it was about sort of a 360 of the surrounding, but allowing for this kind of porosity or a space, a liminal space for things to kind of flow through, a space to open dialogue.
But I don't want to. There are rules about how you can engage the monuments in the parks.
So I think your piece is very significant in terms of art history, in terms of history, in terms of social practice, institutional critique, and also inventing new languages, new words, new forms. Specifically though, can you address how your work may relate to social practice and institutional critique?
Well, I think that, you know, the study of history itself is an institution. So I'm not a PhD. I come at it as a layman, and I can do my own research, and I can educate myself, and I can also make my own pictures. I think that obviously if you make images that are counter to dominant images, then you're creating a whole new way for people to conceive of themselves. But I don't think that this is I don't think that what I'm doing here is in opposition to history or even institutions. I think actually what I'm doing is making a table with 3 legs have 4, and it becomes more stable, because it seems false to me that you exclude all the people of color in the history of America. So I don't think of myself as a counter narrative, and I don't think I'm revising history. I think that just I provide a lens that allows people to have a bigger doorway to walk through, and when that happens, more people are happy, and also you get better history. So that's what I mean, and I think that, you know, a lot of the way that I talk about my work, I used to lecture to, you know, not art students, but regular people about art history, and I started to realize that, like, they don't use words like we use words. They're regular people. They're civilians. So I stopped thinking about whether I was doing institutional critique, and I started thinking about whether I was adding stories that people were interested in. And that made it a lot different, the way that I made work. And it also, I started asking myself if I was making images that people would feel were complex or unique, or even just whether or not people would feel their lives were added to in a public way. So that's more the way I think about work, and I try never to use I don't use art historical terms. I just talk about the work that I do, because the work that I do is about having people have conversations.
So your work is very much about having a dialogue with society, with culture,
Sure.
with people in a social space, in a park, and opening up a space for discourse. I like this metaphor you use of giving a three-legged table four legs,
Sure.
and presenting information that is missing, that absolutely needs to be contextualized and a part.
But then you're not changing anything. It's still a table.
Right. It's still a table, but there's more.
There's just more. Yeah.
And it actually functions much better.
Exactly.
Which is very significant in terms of functionality, and even functionality of form, in the way you're able to present the idea of people that have been left out. I'm thinking about this as a portrait. You talk about this as maybe a portrait, a metaphorical portrait of people that might have been left out, or does it refer in terms of its materiality to people or to specific?
Well, I mean, it does refer to groups of people who are Africans, many of whom were enslaved, Africans who were freed because they fought in the revolution. But it's an abstraction, and it's there to work as an emotional portal. So I remember when I installed it, it was 95 degrees, 90% humidity. I'm losing 5 pounds a day installing it. And one of the people who works in the parks came up and she said, I feel like this work is ugly. And I was like, cool, why do you think it's ugly? And we talked about why it was ugly to her. And then we started talking about the history of the Africans. She happened to be African American. We started talking about the history of the Africans who had fought in the war. And afterwards, she still thought it was ugly, but she thought that that was an appropriate way to make this piece. And it had meaning to her. So then the next day I saw her and she was telling everybody about this ugly work that she had seen that had this meaning to her personally. I hadn't told her that she was wrong. I hadn't told her that it should be beautiful. I hadn't told her anything. I just told her why I used the materials that I used and where it fit for me. And she did all the work herself. And when you're here and this is not my studio. Everybody who lives here around the sculpture, they're all as much a part of the creation as me. They interrogate you on the way in, they interrogate you when you're there, they skateboard around it, they live with it. This is their living room. And so the work is theirs, it's not mine. I'm not making it for me. So this is a way that people have room, and there isn't one thing I want people to get out of it. So if I make a portrait of any one person to put next to Washington, I think I would be limiting people. So I give people an abstraction and I give them multiple points to enter. I give them a lot of ways to see history, and that this object is some parallel to that for me, but I won't say how, because I don't know that I could. So, and I think that that's one of the wonderful things about making work in abstraction, that you're allowing people to speak their mind, even if they're babies.
Right. To relate to it on
Yes.
their own terms,
Right.
which is pre-linguistic,
Sure.
before language, even though I do believe that this piece very much engages in a dialogue, in a discourse with a pre-existing sort of homogenous, maybe intensely patriarchal, the founding father, this mythology of freedom and justice for all,
Sure.
and opening up a space for new narratives and new ideas and new languages, and for people to engage in a critique about culture, about history, and maybe see themselves in it and sew it into it.
But I think that that's the most important thing. When I talk about enslaved Africans, I'm not just talking about James Armstead Lafayette. I'm talking about Sojourner Truth. I'm talking about Phyllis Wheatley, who's the first published author, who was somebody who corresponded with George Washington, George Washington was not willing to free the slaves that he knew were fully human, even though he was having this ongoing dialogue with Phyllis Wheatley, who was a freed African slave. And this adds a more complex way of viewing him, but also of viewing Phyllis Wheatley, and also of viewing Sally Hemings, who was the concubine and slave of Thomas Jefferson and bore him children. And you realize that, like, Thomas Jefferson enslaved his children. So it's a really complicated place to begin.
Yes.
But at the same time, when you realize that, we wouldn't have got to where we've gotten to without all those people throwing their lives at this problem, and doing so successfully, then it becomes a much richer history, and I think it becomes a more important history to many more people. Inclusion is always a better route to go than sort of segregated history, and that is what many people are getting. They're getting segregated history, and I just don't believe that. But the way I do it is to make an open platform and let people accept and reject it as they want. And that's how I view that. And I'm strongly in favor of, you know, more people speaking about the founding mothers, which no one ever says that term, but there's clearly Abigail Adams and numbers of other women who were part of the revolution and fought for all the liberties that we have now. Abigail Adams was the wife of John Adams, edited most of his material, and and helped write most of his material, even up until the point he was president. So you realize there are a lot of founding mothers, and we don't have enough people spending time on the work to expose them.
Right. Well, I think this is incredibly important work, and
Thank you.
there's certainly much more we could talk about, but just in parting, I'd love to hear a little bit about what you're planning for the future beyond this piece coming up.
I'm working on a project right now, and in 2020 we're working on a project in Greenwood Cemetery. I can't say exactly what it will be because I haven't come up with the idea yet. But each project has to take a lot from its site, and Greenwood Cemetery is over 1,000 acres. It's a lot of site, so I have to consider that quite strongly. But now I have all these exciting ideas, but I never really look past the piece I'm in now, and I always think that every piece is going to be my last piece. So I'm 100% right now. You know, I'm really engaged in the dialogue around this piece and being here and allowing people and thankful that you want to have a conversation around what's happening in this one.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for engaging in a dialogue with me about this amazing project. I feel honored to meet with you and talk with you about this great work of art. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. A pleasure.
Okay.
Right on.
All right.